standard song, a la George Gershwin or Rodgers and Hart.
Picture this. Los Angeles, 1979. Backstage at the legendary Troubadour is buzzing with life. Guitars wail through soundcheck. Glasses clink and rock icons drift through the halls as if it were their temple. Then, suddenly, chaos. A young assistant bursts into the promoter's office, pale and breathless. Linda Ronstadt has just walked out of the green room again. The reason? A single name on the performance list. Not hers, not the Eagles, his. One glance at that name and Linda was gone. No words, no confrontation, just a quiet, deliberate exit that left behind a thick, uneasy silence. 4 years later, no one truly knew what happened that night. And Linda, she never spoke of it. No public feuds, no outbursts for the tabloids, only calm interviews and the image of a woman composed, proud, and untouchable. But now that silence has finally been broken. In a rare moment of raw honesty, Linda Ronstadt has revealed the 7 names she never forgave. The ones who wounded her pride, challenged her artistry, and exposed the ruthless underbelly of the music industry. And that list is nothing like anyone expected. These aren't petty grudges or fading rivalries. These are the stories that shaped an entire era where power, betrayal, and quiet revenge intertwined in the blazing world of rock and roll. And the most shocking part, some of those names once stood closest to her. The first, a drummer who rose to fame, used Linda as a stepping stone, and then trampled over the very path she helped him build. Think you know who it is? Think again. A man who believed he was the heartbeat of the band but forgot who gave him his first chance. Before the Eagles became rock royalty, Don Henley was just Linda Ronstadt's drummer and backup singer, the man she once helped bring into the spotlight. In the early 1970s, Linda Ronstadt was the rising star, selling out theaters from coast to coast. Don Henley back then was the quiet drummer in the background, quietly riding the wave of her success. It was Linda who gave him his first real break, the opportunity that set everything in motion. But once the Eagles took flight, everything changed. Henley was no longer the humble musician she once knew. His ego grew in perfect sync with the band's fame, and soon gratitude was replaced by pride. The band that had once opened for Linda now strutted down Sunset Boulevard as if they owned it. Henley especially carried himself like the king of Laurel Canyon, distant, untouchable, and dismissive of the woman who helped put him on the map. The breaking point came in 1975. Backstage at the Universal Amphitheater, Henley made a remark that would sting for decades. He mocked Linda's artistic direction, sneering that she should stick to singing covers and leave the songwriting to the real artists. His words weren't just offensive. They erased everything she had fought for with heart, grit, and raw talent. Linda didn't explode. She didn't argue. She simply turned, revoked his tour credentials on the spot, and walked away. No warning, no second chances. Whispers spread quickly through the industry. Everyone knew Henley's ego had gotten out of control. Friends and colleagues spoke quietly of cocaine-fueled tirades, self-centered decisions, and the cutting remarks he'd throw behind closed doors. For Linda, the deepest wound wasn't betrayal. It was disrespectful. In private, she would later describe him with a single haunting phrase, a climber who lost his soul chasing fame. But Don Henley wasn't the only one who crossed the line. Linda's next clash didn't happen quietly backstage. It unfolded live in front of an audience. A drunk frontman, a hijacked microphone, and a moment of public humiliation so raw she never forgot it. It was the night Jim Morrison went too far. 1968, the summer of love had come and gone, but the chaos remained. The Doors were unstoppable, igniting every stage they touched, while Linda Ronstadt was still clawing her way up in a male-dominated industry. That night at a private after-party near the Whiskey A Go-Go, legends and misfits mingled freely. No one could have predicted what would happen when Jim Morrison spotted Linda. He was already several drinks in, shirt half unbuttoned, swaggering through the crowd. Mid-performance, in a haze of ego and intoxication, Morrison suddenly pulled Linda on stage. No warning, no consent. It wasn't charming, it wasn't spontaneous, it was reckless. Then, right there in front of everyone, he leaned in and tried to kiss her. Linda reacted instinctively, pulling away. Morrison lost his balance, stumbled into her mic stand, and nearly took the whole setup down with him. Gasps, stares, whispers. The crowd didn't know whether to laugh or hold their breath. The moment was never caught on camera, but it lived on as underground legend, passed around in green rooms and whispered on late-night radio for years to come. Morrison never apologized. In fact, he doubled down. Months later, during a radio interview, he mocked her, calling Linda sweet but spineless, dismissing her as harmless and forgettable. Linda, true to form, never clapped back in public. But behind closed doors, her words cut sharper than any headline. Within her inner circle, she called Jim Morrison a brilliant wreck, a man who carried both genius and destruction wherever he went. To Linda, Jim Morrison wasn't just a wild performer. He was the embodiment of the toxic masculinity that tried to dominate every corner of the music industry. But while Morrison's behavior left emotional scars, the next betrayal cut even deeper. It didn't come from a drunken outburst or a reckless kiss. It came from a friend, someone she believed stood beside her for the same cause until he turned on her when ideals collided with ego. That man was Neil Young. It was 1976. A benefit concert for farm workers had gathered some of the biggest names in rock. Among them, two artists known not only for their voices, but for their convictions, Linda Ronstadt and Neil Young. On the surface, they were allies united by purpose and passion. But once the spotlight hit, everything changed. Backstage, tension simmered. Neil began dismissing Linda's artistic input, rejecting her set list suggestions, blocking her from performing certain songs, and criticizing her sound for being too commercial. Then after the show, things got worse. He reportedly told the press that Linda wasn't built for protest. The message couldn't have been clearer. She wasn't authentic enough for the cause. Linda left the venue in tears. It wasn't just an insult. It was a betrayal from someone she respected, someone she thought shared her values, to be dismissed as hollow by a fellow activist. That wound cut deeper than any critic ever could. That night marked a turning point for Linda. From that moment on, no matter how noble the cause, she never shared a stage with Neil Young again. Behind closed doors, she described him as loud in message, cruel in execution. To her, his activism felt hollow when paired with that kind of arrogance. But if that wound cut her personally, the next one would shatter her artistically. Because the next betrayal didn't come from backstage politics or careless words to the press. It happened in the middle of a studio session in front of a full room of musicians where Linda's confidence was stripped away with a single chilling line. When genius turns to cruelty, Frank Zappa. Their meeting in 1974 carried the promise of something iconic. Frank Zappa, avant-garde, unpredictable, the mad genius of experimental rock. Linda Ronstadt, versatile, fearless, and vocally unstoppable. On paper, their collaboration could have redefined creative boundaries. Instead, it fell apart within hours. It began with promise. Linda showed genuine excitement about recording one of Zappa's songs, but the moment they stepped into the studio, things went sideways. Zappa brushed off her creative ideas with a smirk, calling her sound too clean. He accused her of diluting his music, turning raw art into something that sounded like a jingle for car commercials. The tension peaked during a live rehearsal. Mid-session, Zappa raised his hand and stopped the band cold. The room went silent. Then in front of everyone, he sneered. This is what happens when you hand real music to a pop singer. The air froze. No one moved. No one spoke. Linda didn't argue or lash out. She simply gathered her things and walked out, humiliated, hurt, and done. She never returned. And she never worked with Zappa again. Publicly, she said nothing. As always, her silence said it all. Behind the scenes, those closest to her remember her words vividly. Linda called Frank Zappa brilliant but brutal, a mind she deeply respected, but a man she could never trust again. Still, clashes with difficult artists were one thing. What came next, though, was far more personal, because the next name on her list wasn't a wild frontman or an eccentric genius. It was someone she once called family, a fellow pioneer who turned his back on her when it mattered most. The Laurel Canyon fallout. David Crosby. In the golden haze of Laurel Canyon, Linda Ronstadt and David Crosby were more than collaborators. They were kindred spirits. They shared stages, studios, and a belief in the same countercultural ideals that defined an era. Crosby's soaring harmonies and Linda's genre-defying vocals rode the same revolutionary wave, and for a time, their bond seemed unbreakable. But by 1978, that harmony began to unravel. During a recording session for a joint project, Linda requested a simple key change, one that suited her range better. Crosby refused, brushing her off with a cold. "You should learn to adapt." What could have been a minor disagreement spiraled quickly. Tempers flared, harsh words were exchanged, and the argument didn't stay confined to the studio walls. Within days, rumors spread through the canyon, and soon the story hit the press, becoming one of the most talked about rifts in that tight-knit scene. Then, Crosby crossed the line. In an interview with Rolling Stone, he dismissed Linda as manufactured, implying she was more image than artistry. For Linda, a woman who had built her entire career on authenticity, instinct, and raw talent, it was a betrayal that cut straight to the core. She didn't fire back, not in interviews or on stage. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't a weakness, it was the sound of a bridge burning. She didn't lash out publicly. Instead, Linda made her statement in silence. Behind the scenes, she took decisive action. His name was banned from conversation within her band and inner circle. Studio musicians were instructed not to mention him. His songs were erased from her tour playlists. To Linda, David Crosby no longer existed. In her eyes, Crosby hadn't just betrayed a friendship. He had betrayed the very spirit of Laurel Canyon, that sacred bond of authenticity and artistic freedom they once shared. In private, she spoke of him as a warning, proof that even the brightest minds could be swallowed whole by ego, addiction, and fame. But if Crosby's betrayal cut deep on a personal level, the next one was colder, sharper, a public attack that turned punk wit into venom. The punk provocation, Elvis Costello's public insult. It was 1979 and Cleveland was electric with anticipation. A massive music festival had brought together the biggest names in rock, legends, and rising stars alike. Linda Ronstadt, fresh off a run of chart-topping albums, was one of the headliners. At the height of her career, she was commanding, confident, and respected. All eyes were on her, and among those eyes was Elvis Costello, the new provocateur on the scene. Sharp-tongued, unapologetic, the punk poet who prided himself on tearing down icons. But no one expected what came next. Surrounded by reporters, Costello sneered and dismissed Linda's performance as background music for brunch. Tea wasn't just a jab, it was a public humiliation. The comment spread like wildfire through the press. And when Linda confronted him backstage, hoping for an explanation or maybe an apology, she was met with something colder. Costello, reportedly drunk and defiant, looked her straight in the eye, threw out another cruel remark, and walked away without a trace of remorse. Linda never looked back. To her, Elvis Costello wasn't just a rude musician, he symbolized something deeper, something she despised about the changing face of the industry. He represented a new kind of artist, sharp-minded but cold-hearted, endlessly critical, yet devoid of compassion. Not rebellious, just cruel for the sake of attention. In his defiance, Linda saw no soul, only ego. And yet, even that bitterness couldn't compare to the final heartbreak on her list, because the last name wasn't a wild rock star or a brash newcomer. It was someone whose music should have blended perfectly with hers, a voice so compatible it felt destined. But behind the scenes, their collaboration turned from dream to quiet disaster, perfection or control. Paul Simon's cold dismissal. In 1982, the idea seemed flawless. Paul Simon, one of the most respected songwriters of his generation, joining forces with Linda Ronstadt, the reigning queen of boundary-breaking vocals. When news broke that they would record a duet for his upcoming album, both fans and critics were ecstatic. On paper, it was magic waiting to happen. In reality, it became a slow unraveling. From the very first rehearsal, the chemistry was off. Simon scrutinized every note, stopping to correct phrasing that didn't need correcting. He rewrote sections of the song without telling her, offering suggestions that felt more like veiled criticisms. Those who knew Linda later said she described the experience in one painful sentence. It felt like being scolded by a school principal. Every note she sang was dissected, not appreciated. Every take met with correction, not collaboration. Whatever spark they might have shared was smothered under layers of ego and control. The chemistry never clicked. The song was left unfinished, shelved, forgotten, never released, and never spoken of again. But for Linda, the wound went far deeper than a lost recording. It wasn't about one song. It was about dignity, about being treated as less than the artist she was. A voice like hers deserved partnership. Instead, she found herself standing across from a dictator. From that moment on, Linda made herself a quiet vow. She would never record with Paul Simon again. And with that final fracture, the silence surrounding Linda Ronstadt's greatest betrayals began to unravel. 7 musicians, 7 scars, all hidden beneath decades of grace until now. Because behind every harmony lies a story no one hears until someone finally decides to tell it. So why did she stay silent all these years? Simple. Linda Ronstadt was never one to chase gossip or fuel tabloid feuds. For decades, she let her voice do the talking. But these revelations aren't about revenge. They're about truth. Linda built her legacy not just on extraordinary talent, but on endurance, surviving egos, betrayals, and an industry that often showed no mercy. And in breaking her silence now, she isn't tearing anyone down. She's revealing the cost of staying strong in a world that rarely allows women to be both brilliant and unapologetic. Because sometimes the greatest power doesn't lie in the songs we sing, but in the silence we finally choose to break. Which story shocked you the most? And do you think Linda was right to stay silent all those years? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.